My name is Lorraine Baxter, and I was only gone 3 days. 3 days in the hospital after a fainting spell. Nothing serious, they said. Just a few tests and fluids, but when I stepped back into my own home, I felt like a stranger. The curtains were drawn in that way I don't like, the way that makes the whole house feel like it's holding its breath, and the air had that stale, empty smell that let me know before I even called his name that something was wrong. I walked through each room calling for Miso, my little terrier who has slept at my feet every night for the past 10 years, who once sat so still beside me when I cried after Harold died that I thought he understood more than most people ever could. No tags jingled, no claws on tile, just silence. When I asked Jeremy where he was, he looked up from his phone like I'd interrupted something important and said, so casually it made my blood chill, "Oh, Tasha took him to a shelter." He was kind of a lot, as if he were a bag of clothes or a couch that didn't fit anymore. I remember gripping the back of the dining chair so hard my knuckles turned white, and Tasha, without even pausing her salad, added, "They said he'd be fine, probably adopted already." My knees wobbled, but I didn't sit. I just stared at the both of them, my own son and his wife, sitting in the house I had paid for, eating food from my fridge, making decisions like I no longer had a say in what mattered to me. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I walked upstairs to the bedroom, opened the linen closet, and pulled out Miso's old blanket, the one he always curled up in when it rained. It still smelled faintly of him. That's when it hit me. Not just what they had done, but how small I must have become in their eyes for them to think it was acceptable. I was still recovering from a hospital stay, bruises still yellowing on my arms from IVs, and they couldn't even keep a dog fed for 3 days. No apology, no permission. Just gone. As if he were an inconvenience, not my heartbeat. I tucked the blanket under my arm, grabbed my purse, and left the house without another word. They didn't ask where I was going. They didn't follow. Maybe they thought I'd forget, that I'd get over it. But as I turned the key in the ignition, eyes blurring, I made a quiet promise to myself and to Miso. They had taken something I loved and discarded it like trash. I wasn't going to raise my voice. I was going to raise the stakes. They would learn in time that there are consequences for cruelty. And this time, it would be delivered with a signature, not a scream. I didn't even change out of my robe. I threw on my old slippers, the ones with the worn soles and faded floral print, and grabbed my keys with trembling fingers. My purse was still in the car from earlier, and thank God for that, because I wouldn't have thought to bring my license or wallet otherwise. I don't remember backing out of the driveway. I just remember the way the world blurred as I drove, like I was seeing it through water. My heart was beating so fast, it made my ears ring. Every red light felt like a betrayal. Every slow car in front of me a personal attack. I gripped the wheel tighter than I should have, whispering prayers with cracked lips and a tongue that felt too thick in my mouth. I didn't know what I'd find when I got there. I was terrified that I'd be too late, that someone else had taken him, or worse, that he'd been moved somewhere cold and bureaucratic, a place where names get turned into numbers and no one bothers to learn what kind of blanket he likes. The shelter was smaller than I remembered, a little brick building tucked beside a shuttered laundromat with peeling paint and a flickering sign that simply read, "Animal Services." I slammed the car door and half ran to the entrance, ignoring the way my robe flapped behind me. The front desk clerk blinked at me like I was a ghost. And when I gasped out his name, Miso, terrier brought in 3 days ago, she pointed toward the back with a cautious look. I followed the smell of antiseptic and fear, the kind that clings to cages and tile floors. And then I saw him, curled up in the corner of a small metal kennel, shaking like a leaf in winter. His little nose pressed to the bars. When he saw me, he didn't bark. He didn't move. He just looked at me like I'd come back from the dead. I knelt down, pressing my hand to the cage, and his paw reached out, tentative and trembling, and I felt my chest cave in around the edges. A young volunteer approached quietly, clipboard in hand, and said, almost apologetically, that he'd been marked for transport that afternoon to a high-volume shelter out of state. "Not enough room here," she said. "But he's lucky you came. Another hour, and he'd have been gone." I signed the release forms with a hand that refused to stop shaking, and when they brought him out to me, he leapt into my arms like a child who had just woken from a nightmare. I clutched him to my chest, pressing my face into his fur, breathing him in like he was air, and I had been drowning. As I walked back to the car, cradling him like something sacred, I knew that saving Miso wasn't the end of this story. It was only the beginning. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why or how or what on earth they were thinking. I walked through the front door with Miso bundled against my chest in a towel the shelter lent me, and I moved through my house like a ghost visiting the living. Jeremy was sprawled across my couch with his shoes on, something I used to scold him for when he was a boy. And Tasha had commandeered my favourite armchair, the one with the quilted floral cushion that still smelled faintly of my late husband's aftershave. They barely looked up. Jeremy muttered something about me being back early, and Tasha asked if I remembered to pick up more oat milk. Miso whimpered once as I passed the threshold of the kitchen, but I murmured to him softly, soothing him like I used to when he was a shaking little pup, unsure of thunderstorms and car rides. I pulled out a pot, filled it with water, added a bit of the low-sodium chicken broth I kept for sick days, and set it to simmer. I shredded up some cooked chicken breast I had frozen last week and let it warm through. Miso watched me from the crook of his bed on the floor, eyes following every move, tail thumping quietly each time I met his gaze. I set the bowl gently in front of him, waited as he sniffed it, then sat beside him on the linoleum floor, rubbing his ears until the trembling in his body started to melt. Through the doorway, I could hear Jeremy laughing at something on the television, and Tasha tapping on her phone like her thumbs had something more important to say than her mouth ever could. My silence wasn't empty. It had weight. It had shape. It pressed against the walls harder than any scream I could have thrown. I noticed the little things with razor focus. Jeremy had left a damp towel balled on the bathroom floor. Tasha had replaced my sugar jar with some glass monstrosity labelled in lowercase script. The teacups I collected were now crowded on the top shelf to make room for their protein powders and shaker bottles. Their dog, if they had one, would never have been left behind. That much I knew. As Miso curled against my thigh and finally closed his eyes with something close to peace, I didn't have to say a word to know that everything had changed. The people who once came from my body and once depended on my arms to be held and fed and protected had now turned my home into a convenience, but it would not be theirs forever. I stroked Miso's ears, slowly, methodically, and with every gentle pass of my fingers, I etched the beginning of a new boundary into my bones. They had mistaken my silence for surrender, but I was simply choosing the kind of noise that leaves a permanent echo. I told them I needed space to clean out the guest room closet, which used to be Jeremy's when he was still afraid of thunderstorms and had a nightlight shaped like a dinosaur. Tasha offered to help, but I declined with a smile that didn't meet my eyes and shut the door gently behind me. Once alone, I knelt down and pulled the old lockbox from beneath the bed, the one I hadn't opened in nearly 5 years. Not since after Harold passed, and I had to sort through life insurance papers with hands that still trembled. Inside, the papers were still crisp, still dated, still waiting. My fingers brushed across folders, labelled in my neat accountant's handwriting, bank statements, pension summaries, tax documents, the deed to the house I worked 2 jobs to pay off. I laid them out like tarot cards on the quilted bedspread, each one a reflection of the life I had built. Brick by brick. Decision by decision. I retrieved the binder with my living trust, a green 3-ring with worn edges, and flipped to the pages that used to make me feel secure, the ones where I had named Jeremy as executor and Tasha as secondary. My name was typed over and over again, and yet somehow I felt invisible within those pages. I found the section labelled Distribution of Assets, and my mouth flattened to a line so straight it could slice. I uncapped a red pen from the junk drawer beside the nightstand and drew a clean circle around the clause that gave the house to Jeremy upon my death. My hand didn't shake. I circled it again, slower this time, and then placed a sticky note beside it that simply read, Review. I thought about Miso caged and shivering, about the way Jeremy didn't even glance at me when I walked back into my own home with a broken heart swaddled in a towel. I heard his voice echo in my memory, lazy and dismissive, saying, He's just a dog, Mum. But Miso had been my shadow, my comfort, my conversation partner on quiet mornings. He had been my proof that I could still care for something small and precious after loss. I pulled out another folder, this one with the contact information for my lawyer, and set it on top of the pile. I was not some confused old woman hoarding paper. I was an archivist of my own worth, reclaiming what had once been handed out in blind trust. I folded everything back into the lockbox, except the living trust, which I kept out, propped against a pillow. As I stood up and dusted my knees, I could hear Tasha laughing from the living room, her voice airy, carefree, hollow. That closet had once held board games and baby blankets. Now it held the beginning of my correction. I opened the window, let the stale air out, and promised myself this time the house would answer to me. I hadn't dialed Miss Patel's number in over 2 years, but when I did, she picked up before the second ring like she'd been waiting for me. Her voice still held that calm, measured rhythm that always made me feel as though the world could pause for a moment and make room for clarity. When I told her I needed to speak in person, she said, My door's open. Bring Miso if you like. That single sentence nearly undid me. It had only been 4 days since I rescued him from the shelter, but I was still half expecting the universe to punish me for it, to take him again as casually as Jeremy and Tasha had. I brushed his ears and told him we were going for a drive, then put on real shoes and the blue cardigan with the missing button. Miss Patel greeted us both like family. Her office unchanged in its quiet elegance, books lined with precision, a photo of her grandchildren tucked beside her diploma, and a lemon tea already steeping on the tray by the window. I sat across from her, Miso curled under my chair, his head on my foot like an anchor. I explained everything in the kind of voice people mistake for calm, but is really just exhaustion that's learned how to walk upright. Miss Patel didn't interrupt. She only nodded occasionally, her pen hovering without writing. When I mentioned the shelter, her mouth tightened, and when I recounted Jeremy's words, too much trouble, her eyes flared, just briefly, but it was enough. I pulled out the trust binder, opened it to the same page I had circled in red, and asked her what my options were if I wanted to make some quiet corrections. She leaned back, folded her hands, and said, Quite a few. There was no judgment in her tone, only precision and invitation. She explained how I could revise my estate plan, revoke the current provisions, and issue a new will with updated terms. She assured me there was no obligation to inform the current beneficiaries, not if I had lost trust in them. When I hesitated, wondering aloud if it was too spiteful, she said something I'll never forget. Protecting what matters isn't spiteful. It's wise stewardship. I felt the room shift then, as if the very air had aligned with my spine. We sipped our tea, the lemon bright against the bitterness of the conversation, and outlined a new version of my future one where Miso would have a guardian, where Jeremy and Tasha would receive nothing more than what their presence had earned. and where the home I had built would no longer be handed to those who saw it as convenience rather than sanctuary. As we wrapped up, she knelt to scratch Miso behind the ears and whispered, "They forgot he was family. You didn't." And just like that, the next chapter of my life began with a signature waiting on her desk. It felt almost surreal, sitting in Miss Patel's office again just 2 days later. The sun trailing lazy gold patterns across the legal pads and neatly stacked folders, as if to say, even light pauses to consider what matters. Miso sat on the armchair beside me this time, curled into a tight comma of fur and forgiveness, unaware that his very presence was about to change the trajectory of an entire family legacy. Miss Patel slid a blank draft across the desk, her pen poised like a blade that cut cleanly through sentiment and nonsense. "You mentioned you wanted something firm," she said gently, "but also fair. I believe I have the language." I nodded, my throat tight. It wasn't revenge I wanted. Not really. It was preservation, protection, a safeguard against the kind of careless cruelty Jeremy and Tasha had shown when they dropped Miso at a shelter like an old coat gone out of season. Miss Patel began reading aloud, her voice steady and warm. The clause was simple, but its teeth were sharp. It stated that any heir to my estate, named or future, who was proven to have willfully neglected, harmed or surrendered without consent any living creature under my care would automatically forfeit their inheritance. It made no difference whether it was a dog, a cat, a person, or a plant. "If you love it," Miss Patel said, tapping the paper, "they respect it, or they walk away empty-handed." We added documentation next, the intake report from the shelter showing Jeremy as the one who dropped Miso off. Signed and dated. The shelter's log marking Miso for out-of-state transport. And the text message from Jeremy to Tasha that I had screenshotted the moment I saw it, where he casually said, "Dropped the mutt at the shelter. She'll probably thank us later." That last line stayed with me, bitter as black coffee. Miss Patel stapled each exhibit neatly to the draft, then placed a yellow sticky tab where I would sign once everything was finalized. There was no gloating in the room, just a quiet sort of justice that made the air easier to breathe. I looked over at Miso, who had lifted his head and was watching me with those liquid brown eyes that had once stared from behind cold shelter bars, and I felt something settle inside me. Not vengeance, not bitterness, just clarity. Love is not just a feeling, it's a boundary, a clear line between what we will allow and what we will never again excuse. As I rose to leave, Miss Patel handed me a copy of the clause and said, "You're doing more than rewriting a will. You're writing your values in ink." I tucked it into my purse beside a pack of tissues and a small treat for Miso. Outside, the breeze smelled like sun-warmed earth and second chances. I opened the car door, helped Miso into the seat and whispered, "You're safe now, and so is everything I love." The morning I walked into the county clerk's office, I wore the same navy cardigan I had on the day I brought Miso home for the first time, the sleeves still smelling faintly of lavender and memory. There was something ceremonial about it, like I needed to mark the moment with quiet intention. The woman behind the desk wore chunky glasses and offered me a pen without asking questions, which I appreciated. Miss Patel had already done the legwork, compiling the documents neatly in a manila folder labeled amendments. But it still felt like stepping over a line I could never uncross. I flipped open the trust deed and stared at the names that once held so much weight. Jeremy Baxter and Tasha Lee Baxter, listed as contingent beneficiaries to my home in the event of my death, illness, or declared incapacity. Seeing their names printed so officially, so permanently, after what they had done to Miso made my stomach turn. I pulled out a fresh page, Miss Patel's edition, and read over the new clause one last time before signing. I was removing them from the deed, effective immediately. Instead, I was naming my niece Riley Thorne as the sole beneficiary of the property. Riley, who had once slept on my couch for a month after her heart was broken by someone who couldn't see her light. Riley, who brought Miso his favorite peanut butter treats every Christmas. Riley, who cried quietly into his fur without asking for anything more than a soft place to land. She had never asked me for a thing. Not even this. That was what made her worthy of it. The clerk stamped the document, and I tucked it back into my bag, my hand steady, my heart a little lighter. As I left the building, I passed a young couple arguing about whose turn it was to walk their dog, and I wanted to tell them that if you are lucky enough to be loved by something that cannot speak, you protect it with every part of yourself. But I said nothing, just smiled softly, and walked past. At home, Jeremy was sprawled on the recliner with his shoes on the coffee table, Tasha flipping through her phone with a smirk that made my teeth clench. I moved past them with the grace of someone carrying a secret. They didn't know the locks were changing next week. They didn't know the deed no longer held their names. They didn't know they were already guests in a home that would never be theirs. Upstairs, I sat beside Miso, who was snoring gently with his chin on a throw pillow. I stroked his back and whispered, "We did it, buddy." He didn't stir, just let out a soft huff like he had known all along. And maybe he had. Dogs always know who's safe, who's true, and who would walk through fire to bring them home. I had done all three. It started the morning Jeremy wandered into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes like a boy who had just remembered to play nice. He opened the fridge, pulled out the oat milk he always mocked me for buying, and said, real casual-like, "So how's Miso doing?" I paused, my hand wrapped around a teacup, and looked at him like he had asked me how to build a rocket. "He's fine," I said. And Jeremy nodded, as if that opened a door to a long-lost connection. He asked what kind of food Miso preferred, if he needed new shots, whether he still liked that blue ball he used to chase down the hallway. I stirred honey into my tea, watching the swirl of gold disappear into warmth, and gave him answers that were polite but short. Jeremy never used to notice Miso unless the dog was in his way, and now suddenly he had a heart full of concern. That night, Tasha chimed in too, calling from the living room where she lay, draped across my couch, scrolling through her phone. "Maybe we should take Miso to the dog park sometime," she said, like the idea had bloomed in her chest rather than landed in her lap after an urgent whisper from Jeremy. I looked down at Miso, curled at my feet, his tail flicking once with the indifference of a creature who remembered everything. I smiled and nodded, said maybe that would be nice, and stored the moment in the same mental file where I kept passive-aggressive Christmas gifts and overdue thank yous. These weren't gestures of affection. They were a campaign. A pitiful performance now that they sensed something had shifted. Maybe they had peeked at my legal folders. Maybe they had overheard my quiet calls with Miss Patel. Or maybe, just maybe, they had begun to realize that love isn't something you stash away at a shelter because it's inconvenient. I watched them try to dress their guilt in curiosity, like a child trying to hide a broken vase with flowers. They laughed louder at dinner, lingered longer in the kitchen, offered to take out the trash or walk Miso around the block. But their sudden attentiveness felt like too little and far too late. I answered kindly, even chuckled at their poor attempts to recall his favorite treat. But deep in my chest, a stillness had settled. It was the stillness that comes when you've already made your choice, and now you're simply waiting for the clock to catch up. I let them fumble through their small, clumsy redemptions, but every time they said Miso's name, it sounded like a password they no longer had access to. I wasn't angry anymore. I was aware. and awareness has a silence sharper than rage. Miso stretched out beside me, his soft breath steady, and I whispered, not to him but to myself, "They remember you now." But only because I do. The eggs were still warm, and the orange juice freshly poured when I said it, slicing into the quiet like a butter knife through soft toast. We were sitting around the table, Jeremy fiddling with his phone between bites, Tasha lazily spearing strawberries, and me pretending not to notice the way their politeness had grown suspiciously polished over the last week. I refilled my own teacup, then set it down with just enough weight for it to make a sound. "I updated my documents," I said breezily, as if I were talking about changing the batteries in the smoke detector. Jeremy looked up, blinked once, then twice. "What documents?" he asked. Slow and careful, like stepping around a snake he hadn't seen coming. I took a bite of my scone, chewed thoughtfully and said, "You know, Will, trust, power of attorney, that sort of thing. Miss Patel's very efficient." Tasha's fork stalled mid-air. Jeremy cleared his throat, and I watched the invisible weight of curiosity settle over both of them like pollen on glass. "Oh," I added with a lightness that could have passed for innocence. "Just wanted to make sure Miso's protected. You understand? After that shelter mix-up, wouldn't want him ending up in the wrong hands again." The silence that followed was so thick you could have poured it over pancakes. Tasha tried to chuckle, but it sounded brittle, like a glass cracking under pressure. Jeremy leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms, the same way he used to when he was about to argue with his teachers. "You don't think we meant any harm?" he said, his voice carefully measured. "It was just temporary." I tilted my head, letting the moment stretch like dough before baking. Temporary or not, he was scared. I was scared too. When I came home and found him gone, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The truth didn't require volume, only precision. Miso rested under the table, unaware or unconcerned, his tail curled around my feet like an anchor. I reached down and scratched behind his ear, then smiled at Jeremy and Tasha with all the grace of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. "Anyway," I said, pouring more tea, "it's done. Just wanted you to know. Now, would you like more jam?" Neither of them answered. Their hunger had vanished like morning mist. But mine remained. Not for food, but for peace, for quiet justice, for the unshakable clarity that comes when you've looked at betrayal and refused to wear it like a shawl. I chewed another bite of scone slowly, savouring the butter, the crumbs, and the way it tasted better with the truth finally spoken. Jeremy came stomping into the kitchen like a bull that had finally spotted the red cloth, his footsteps loud and angry across the tile I had just cleaned that morning. He didn't even wait for me to turn around before launching into his performance, accusing me of being spiteful, of blowing things out of proportion, of acting like some petty old woman who couldn't move on. I kept wiping the counter with slow, circular motions, as if polishing away not just crumbs but years of silent disappointments. His voice rose, each word more indignant than the last, calling me dramatic, manipulative, and my personal favourite, impossible to reason with. I suppose it never occurred to him that I'd been listening for years, not just to what he said, but to what he didn't. I didn't speak. I didn't argue. I didn't even sigh. I just reached for my phone resting on the windowsill, opened the voicemail app, and tapped play. The voice on the recording was soft but firm, belonging to a shelter staff member named Paula. She described how Miso had arrived trembling, with matted fur and red, irritated eyes from crying. She detailed how he'd cowered in the corner for hours, too afraid to even accept a biscuit, and how they'd almost sent him to an out-of-state overflow facility because they assumed he was abandoned. The message was clear and clinical, but every word landed like a stone in the silence between us. Jeremy's mouth opened, then closed. His face, so puffed up with righteous anger a moment before, began to collapse inward like a balloon slowly losing air. I looked at him then. Really looked. Not at the man he wanted to be seen as, but at the boy who never learned that love isn't convenient, that loyalty isn't seasonal, and that consequences don't disappear just because he decides he's sorry. I said nothing. I didn't need to. The voicemail had done all the talking. I simply stared at him, my eyes steady and unblinking, the way a woman looks at someone she has already removed from her future. Miso padded into the room just then, tail wagging softly, and rested his chin on my foot like a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence I had been writing in silence for far too long. Jeremy turned to leave, muttering something about me not understanding what it's like to be under pressure. I let him go, without response. Let him carry that weight back to whatever version of the world he believed in. I poured myself a cup of tea, stirred in a little honey, and took a long sip while the warmth spread through my chest. It was not revenge I tasted, but clarity. And clarity, when brewed just right, is far more satisfying than rage. There was a time I couldn't move through my own house without shrinking, as though the walls might complain about my presence, as though every cupboard door or creaking floorboard demanded an apology. I used to tiptoe around my own kitchen when Jeremy and Tasha were home, always cautious, always correcting myself mid-sentence, always folding myself smaller so they could take up more space without ever noticing the cost. But that version of me is gone now, and the silence she left behind has become something sacred. The morning after Jeremy's outburst, I stood in the hallway staring at the guest room door and realized it was time to reclaim the space they had assumed belonged to them. I pulled out the paint cans I had stored in the basement for years, dusty but full of promise, and I chose a warm, buttery yellow for the walls. It reminded me of spring mornings, of pancakes and sunlight, of beginnings. I played music loud while I worked, the kind with a brass section and too much swing, and Miso would sit at the doorway like a tiny foreman supervising every brush stroke. When the paint dried, I laid down a soft new rug, placed a bookshelf by the far wall, and set Miso's bed right beneath the window so he could sunbathe properly, the way he liked to when he felt safe. I tucked lavender sachets into the pillowcases and left the closet empty, not for guests but for possibility. Then I took my phone, opened the family group chat, and hovered my finger over the screen. The chat was full of performative messages, shared articles no one read, emojis used like duct tape over deeper cracks. I didn't scroll. I didn't reread. I simply pressed delete. The screen went blank, and I felt like I could breathe better. In its place, I created a new list. Not a group chat, not a family circle, but an RSVP list for my 78th birthday. I typed in names like Rochelle, my neighbour who brings me scones on Sundays; Riley, my niece, who always brings the napkins, no one asks for but everyone needs; Mrs. Tran from the library book club; Mr. Bowers from down the street, who always waves twice. I made room for people who show up, people who see me, people who would never leave a creature behind because he was inconvenient. I didn't tell Jeremy or Tasha about the party, not out of malice, but because absence has a voice of its own, and sometimes silence is the most honest RSVP. That night, I cooked dinner without rushing, ate without sharing, and drank a glass of wine while watching Miso fall asleep with his little chest rising in even, contented breaths. I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel cruel. I felt like I had finally come home to myself, and I didn't whisper an apology to the walls. I simply exhaled, and the house exhaled with me. The morning of the garden party, I woke before the birds did, sat at the edge of my bed, and let the stillness wash over me like a quiet benediction. The house was hushed but humming with purpose, filled with the scent of lemon polish and fresh hydrangeas I had clipped the night before. Miso padded softly after me as I moved through the kitchen, placing fruit into bowls, folding napkins into little triangles, and checking the oven, even though I'd outsourced the cooking this time. It wasn't just a party, it was a line drawn in the soil between the woman I used to be and the one I had finally become. The backyard, once dull and forgotten, had been transformed over the past few weeks into something living and warm. Riley had arrived early with a covered basket in one arm and a squeaky toy in the other. She knelt and let Miso jump into her lap before she even said hello. "These are honey and rosemary," she said, opening the basket to reveal biscuits shaped like bones, each wrapped in parchment paper tied with twine. "He deserves nice things." I nodded, my throat thick. The guests trickled in soon after Mr. Bowers with a bouquet of wildflowers, Rochelle with her lemon scones, and a jazz trio from the community centre who set up under the wisteria without fuss, filling the air with soft brass and saxophone notes that swirled like laughter caught on the breeze. There were folding chairs and mismatched cushions, platters of finger sandwiches, pitchers of iced tea with mint floating like little green rafts, and one long table covered in a white cloth stitched by my late sister. People milled about, sipping and smiling, not out of obligation but presence. No one asked what Jeremy or Tasha were doing that day. No one tiptoed around the absence. It was an omission shaped like freedom. I wore a wide-brimmed hat and a linen dress I hadn't dared pull from the closet in years, not since I was told it was a bit too bold for my age. The colour was coral, and it caught the sun in a way that made me feel unapologetically visible. Midway through the afternoon, Riley raised a glass and toasted to second chapters, to found families, and to loving loudly, even when it's not returned. The applause was warm, genuine, and not a single person clapped out of politeness. As the music swelled and the breeze moved through the vines, I looked around at faces that had shown up, stayed, and asked nothing in return. I didn't need a cake or candles or cards that called me Mom out of duty. I had built something else now, something deeper. The gift I gave myself wasn't just a party. It was the proof that love could be replanted in better soil. And sitting beneath that wisteria, with Miso asleep beside me and laughter in the air, I knew it was already blooming. The letter they received was folded with the same precision I used to apply. When balancing ledgers, each crease sharp and intentional, no room for confusion. I imagined the way Jeremy would rip open the envelope, already brimming with the entitlement that had become his second skin, expecting perhaps a belated apology or some sentimental plea for unity. Instead, he would find a formal notice of estate revision, stamped, signed and sealed by my attorney, Miss Patel, written in the kind of cool legal tone that drains all illusion from a situation. Beneath the bold header declaring the irrevocable nature of the document, there sat a single sticky note in my handwriting, the loops still steady despite the tremors that sometimes gripped my fingers these days. "You left my family at a shelter. I left you at a bank." That line had come to me while stirring soup one night. Miso curled at my feet, and it stayed with me like a bell I could not unring. I'd thought about being gentler, more poetic, maybe even a touch vague. But then I remembered his shrug, the way he said too much trouble without even looking me in the eyes, and the decision became clear as water. I'd spent a lifetime protecting people who mistook my silence for softness, who thought my giving nature came without boundaries. But there was nothing soft about what I had done. It was sharp and clean, and long overdue. The document laid everything out plainly. The full removal of Jeremy and Tasha from any claims to the house, the savings, the insurance policies, the heirlooms, and the trust fund I had once started with their names etched in the margins of my dreams. Every cent now reallocated to those who showed up when I was vulnerable and alone, those who had not only cared for me but for the small life I loved most. I imagined Tasha reading the clause about the forfeiture triggered by animal abandonment, her painted nails tapping against the table in disbelief. She would scoff, maybe laugh, calling it dramatic or petty, but beneath the noise would sit the truth, cold and immovable. I had built safeguards into the structure of my goodbye, and that goodbye was final. I didn't need them to understand, not really. Understanding would require empathy, and if they had possessed that, we never would have reached this point. I didn't expect a reply. I didn't expect tears. What I did expect, and what I was sure of, as the sun spilled across my porch and Miso barked at the wind, was silence. The stunned silence that follows when people finally realize that love has limits, that even the softest mother can become a wall they can no longer climb, and that sometimes the only inheritance they're left with is the echo of a door that has been quietly, permanently closed. Riley arrived with 2 duffel bags, a crooked smile, and a box of oat biscuits for Miso. And within hours, the house exhaled like it had been holding its breath far too long. She set her things down softly, as if the walls might bruise, and Miso took to her like he'd found a long-lost littermate, trailing behind her with those cheerful little grunts that once filled the silence I had gotten too used to. Watching them together felt like watching colour bloom on a black and white photograph. The house, once a gallery of careful arrangements and closed doors, began to pulse with life again. Riley hummed when she cleaned, asked questions about every creaking floorboard, and always remembered to turn off the porch light when she came in late. I showed her how to prune the lilacs so they would bloom fuller come spring, guiding her hands with mine, as the shears clicked between us like punctuation marks in a shared sentence. She listened with real attention, the kind that doesn't come from duty but from care. And I found myself talking more than I had in years, not because I was trying to fill the space, but because it finally felt safe to be heard. I gave her the spare keys wrapped in an old lace handkerchief, and she cried a little when I did, the kind of quiet tears that say, "I see what this means." I didn't need to explain the symbolism. She knew. Miso now had 2 laps he trusted, 2 hands that knew where he liked to be scratched, and a new spot on the sunlit rug where he curled between us like a bridge. The walls, once stiff with judgment, softened. The kettle never stayed dry. Fresh rosemary grew in the windowsill again. And for the first time in years, the house began to feel like more than just a container of grief and history. It felt like a place where something could begin again. Riley filled the kitchen with stories, little updates from the animal clinic and memories of her childhood visits here, and each one layered over the bitter memories like fresh paint. We didn't talk about Jeremy and Tasha much. There wasn't any need. Their absence was no longer a wound. It was a space we had chosen not to refill. What mattered now was presence. And Riley's was steady, warm, and unforced. When she laughed, the house echoed. When she sat beside me on the swing with a blanket over our legs, and Miso curled up at our feet, I felt something I hadn't felt since my husband passed. Not just peace, but belonging. I realized then that this house had never really wanted to grow old alone. It had simply been waiting, like I had, for the kind of love that stayed. And now that it was here, everything, every breath, every corner, every brick felt like it had come home too. The tea had gone lukewarm in my hands, but I didn't mind. The warmth I needed was already spilling from the garden where Riley knelt, laughing as Miso darted between flower pots like a dog half his age, tail a blur and eyes sparkling. I watched her brush the hair from her face with dirt-streaked fingers, her sleeves rolled up, and her laughter rising like music through the wisteria vines I once thought I'd let die. The porch swing creaked softly beneath me, slow and steady, the kind of rhythm that matches a heart at peace. Miso hopped into my lap without needing to be called, curling up as if to say, "You did good." I rubbed his ears gently and stared out at the garden, like it was a painting I had waited decades to finish. There was no guilt anymore, no hollow ache, asking what if. I had taken back what was mine, not out of bitterness or revenge, but out of a quiet decision to choose presence over pretense. Jeremy and Tasha had left more than a dog behind when they walked out of this house and into comfort. They had left me. They had left the effort it takes to see someone's soul, to hold space when it's hard, to show up in moments that don't ask for grand gestures, but simply a chair pulled closer, a hand on the kettle, a voice that remembers your favorite tea. I used to think inheritance was about lineage, about duty and tradition and names on papers. But now I know it is about what you carry, not just in your pockets, but in your heart. Riley carries love like a lantern, and this home, my home, needed her light. When I changed the papers, when I rewrote the trust, when I sat in Miss Patel's office and slid the new signatures across the desk, I didn't feel cruel. I felt honest. I felt like a woman no longer asking to be valued, but deciding that she already was. The house agrees with me now. The air inside hums with life. There are no more corners weighted with silence, no more doors closed from habit. Everything is open, gently worn, loved back to life. The swing keeps time with the breeze, the garden blooms where it once withered, and Miso sleeps with a sigh that tells me he knows he's home. I sip my tea, cool and strong, and watch Riley lay new seeds in the dirt with hands that remind me so much of mine, though younger, steadier. She glances up and smiles. And in that moment I see it all, every choice, every silence I broke, every paper I signed, every inch of myself I reclaimed. I don't need applause or approval. I don't need their voices anymore. I have laughter in the garden and a dog in my lap and my name on the deed. And for once in my life, I didn't just survive the story. I wrote the ending.